people look back on Moist's performance in the fall split, it'll be seen as a success, and honestly it should be. After all, they're now second in Europe in points, behind only K-Corp, and they finished it off by making it all the way to the grand finals in that split's major. And maybe more importantly, with their second place finish in Rotterdam, they also earned the second most prize money in Europe during the fall split, being only $2,000 behind K-Corp, which is also pretty nice. So it's fair to say that Moist had a good fall split, but it came dangerously close to being a very disappointing one. They came into the majors Europe's 5th seed out of 5 teams, so they're right on the edge of qualification. But matters became really stressful for them in the 3rd regional when they were eliminated before reaching the top 8, while other teams who were behind them made the top 8, giving them the chance to earn enough points to overtake them and take away the major spot from Moist. And Moist couldn't do anything to stop them except hope those teams lost before it was too late. Team Liquid, Evil Geniuses, G1, and Team Vitality all had a realistic chance to overtake Moist and take their spot away. And if 2 of those teams managed to do it, then Moist would have been kept out of the major. But luckily for them, only Team Liquid managed to pass them, meaning that their spot in the major was safe. But I'm getting a bit off track because the main point is that while Moist played really well at the major, the team that popped off of the LAN and the team that barely qualified for that same LAN might as well have been 2 different rosters. So I want to figure out what was going wrong for them during the regionals and what did they change heading into the major for them to do so well at LAN. The easy answer is that this team is full of LAN boys who are proving to step up in offline competitions, which is absolutely true. But while I'd love to say that they got that dog in them and leave it at that, I think there's a little more to it. So let's find out what that was. If we go back to what I said about this team in the season preview, I was kind of concerned about their defense when they brought in Astral to replace Vatira. And while I did acknowledge the obvious talent and offensive potential that this team has, my worries about their defense kept me from placing them higher on my list. But with those thoughts I had about them, I would have figured that the best case scenario would have involved them scoring and allowing a lot of goals, but still managing to barely outscore their opponents to walk away with wins in high scoring matchups. But that didn't end up being the case. Moist finished the fall split with only the 5th best scoring offense in Europe, being last out of all teams to qualify for the major, which isn't terrible, but with the players that they have, it would have been very easy to see them contending for the highest scoring offense in the region. And on the other end, their defense was actually pretty solid, as they allowed the 4th fewest goals per game in the region, and the 2nd fewest out of all teams to make it to the major. In fact, the only team that was able to match the offensive and defensive production that Moist got was Karmine Corp, who was 1st in offense and 2nd in defense. So if you only looked at those core stats, you probably would have thought that Moist did really good in the regionals. And for the first 2, they actually did, making it to the semifinals both times. But the biggest issue that they had in those tournaments was that they had to face K-Corp in the semifinals both times, and that didn't go very well for them, as they lost 4 games to 1 in both of those series. But the 3rd regional is where things started to actually go wrong for them, because they failed to make the top 8 of that tournament, which put them in danger of losing their spot at the major. So if we're going to take a look at what went wrong for this team, this is the best place for us to do it. I came into the season expecting Moist to have a really aggressive glass cannon playstyle, where they'd be in their opponent's face as often as possible and spending a lot of time on the offensive side of the field. And while they did eventually round into that style, they weren't like that at first, and instead they gradually got more aggressive as the split went on. The first regional was also the one where they played the most passively, spending the 3rd least amount of time in the offensive third as a team out of all the teams to compete. Astral and Joyo would stay back most often, while Rise would be upfield a lot of the time, like we've seen from him in the past. And while some of the series were closer than they would have liked them to be, like when they went to Game 5 against Sonics and Algiri, this less aggressive style still worked out well enough for them to get a top 4 finish. But if we compare their positioning on the field in the first regional to their positioning in the last regional, then we'll see a much more aggressive team. Here, they spent the 2nd most time in the offensive third as a team per 5 minutes, behind only Team Liquid. But on top of that, Moist had more shots, more boosts stolen, and fewer saves in Regional 3 than they did in Regional 1. So Moist was now playing with the aggression that a lot of people expected them to have when the season started, but the bad news is that it wasn't working. As I said before, they failed to make it to the top 8, which is bad enough on its own. But when you look at the fact that their 3 losses in the Swiss stage came against Solary, Heat, and Williams Resolve, that makes it even more disappointing, because those are 3 teams that you would expect Moist to beat pretty comfortably. In a lot of their games from this tournament, their glass cannon playstyle would blow up right in their face, with a lot of bad decisions from the 3rd man position, and a lot of miscommunication between the players, that came from the team wanting to sustain more pressure on offense. Game 2 against Williams Resolve had multiple examples that showed just how bad it was. For the first goal they gave up, Moist have a free ball coming right towards them, which should be an easy touch, but then Rise and Joyo both fly up for it, looking to make the touch that'll keep it in their offensive half, turning this into a very unnecessary double commit. So now with both of them going up for the ball, and Astral still trying to recover back from the offensive side, there's nobody back to play any defense, and this becomes an easy goal for Resolve. You can go back and forth about who should have gone for this, but ultimately I think the blame falls on Rise and Joyo for not communicating this properly. Either one of them could have made a good play on the ball if they were the only one jumping for it, but when they both jump, that's when it becomes a problem. And then you have this play from the same game, where Rise is really close to the play while being the last man back. Astro hits the ball off the corner and sends it infield. And even from Rise's POV, you can see that Noasaki is already up in the air for the ball, and it's going to be really hard, if not impossible, for Rise to beat him to the touch. But since he's so desperate to keep on the offensive pressure, he still goes for it, and gets beat, leaving his own net completely undefended and giving up yet another easy goal. There are plenty of other examples I could use, like Joyo losing this 50 with all 3 Moist players in the offensive half, and Rise being slow to recover, giving up a goal to Solary, or this play against Heat, where Astro's the last man back, and he tries to pass the ball over to Rise, which is easily intercepted and turns into a goal. But I think I've made my point by now. When Moist was at their worst, they were making really bad decisions in an effort to try to maintain offensive pressure, which would compromise their defense and turn into easy goals for their opponents. So, going into the major, Moist could have done one of 2 things. 1, they could have tried to tone down the aggression and have the more passive playstyle that they had shown in the first regional that took them to the semifinals. Or 2, they could stay aggressive like they did in the third regional and just try to do a better job at it and not leave their goal wide open in the process. And since in the major, Moist had the second most time spent in the offensive third, the second least time in the defensive third, on top of having the second fewest saves and the 4th most shots, it's pretty clear that they chose to go with the aggression. And since they made it all the way to the grand finals, it's pretty clear that it worked out for them. But the biggest difference for Moist between the last regional and the major was that they did a much better job of realizing when the aggression wasn't working out for them and making the adjustments they needed to put themselves in a better spot to win. And we see just how important these adjustments were when we look at their 2 series against Karmine Corp. When these 2 teams first matched up in the Swiss stage of the fall major, KC won in a decisive 3-0 sweep, and you could tell how aggressive Moist was trying to be in that matchup. All 3 players had an average speed over 1600, and as a team, they stole almost 1900 boosts per game, which would have easily been high enough to lead the event in that stat. And they even had 6 demos per game in this series, which is also insanely high. But it's not like Moist were making the same terrible mistakes that were hurting them in Regional 3. Actually, a lot of the time, they were doing a really good job of staying on offense, without making any really bad mistakes that would leave their net open. But while they weren't making any huge mistakes, they weren't playing perfectly. And all it would take is one small misstep from Moist while they're on offense to give K-Corp the opening they needed to score on the other end. In Game 1 of that series, Moist got possession at 3 minutes and 30 seconds. And while they had the ball, they were doing a great job of taking patient 50s, following up on their teammates' challenges, and doing what they had to keep the ball on that side of the field. But then, after Rise drops the ball down to Astral, and Joyo demos Exotic to give him even more room, Astral's touch is a little too heavy for him to follow up on, so the ball goes to Vatira and he takes it downfield. And after an unlucky deflection from Joyo in the corner, K-Corp are the ones who walk away from this play with a goal, despite Moist having the ball for so long. Then, later in that same series, Joyo clears the ball upfield and isn't quite able to make the read on the second touch. So with the ball slowly floating above K-Corp's net, Rise figures he has just enough time to quickly steal the opponent's boost before using it to rotate back and play defense. But right when he does that, they manage to pull off a perfect 3-man passing play to get the ball down the length of the field and into their net before Rise ever has a chance to get back. And even with Astral cheating over to that side of the field to try to disrupt the first pass, Itachi's touch to Exotic is so perfect that he's never even able to get close to the ball. So while these 2 plays did have small mistakes from Moist, I don't think that they were nearly as bad as what they were doing in the third regional. And I think that you could honestly get away with these plays against a lot of teams, but Karmine Corp is not one of those teams. If you're going to play aggressively against them, you have to do it perfectly, or they're going to come out on top every time. So when they faced off again in the quarterfinals, Moist wasn't nearly as aggressive, and instead decided to be more patient and hang back on their side of the field more often, rather than going all in on offense whenever they could. All 3 Moist players decreased their average speed, spent more time in the defensive third, stole less boost, and had fewer demos. And because of these changes, they look like a completely different team, especially on defense, where they decreased the number of goals that K-Corp scored by over 2 per game between the 2 series that they played against each other. One example of their patience came in Game 4, where Itachi tries to clear the ball and Ash was in the position to jump for it from the 3rd man spot. But he immediately flips out of it when he sees Exotic going for the ball, choosing instead to be patient and not take himself out of the play so quickly. And this ends up working out for him, because when Exotic misses his touch, Ash was in the perfect spot to follow up on the ball and keep it in their half for just a little bit longer. But even though I think this flip was on purpose, I'm sure that a lot of you will say that he did it on accident. So I'll go through one more example. Here the ball is coming down the side of the field, with Astral rushing in for the challenge from the middle of the field and Rise behind him. Since he has Rise's support, I don't think it would be a bad play at all for Astral to jump on Vatira's dribble immediately to try to disrupt him. But instead of doing that, Astral fakes the challenge and takes the mid boost away before rotating back to goal. Meanwhile, Rise drives back to the corner boost, and once he grabs it, he's able to jump in for the challenge. This slows down KC's advance a little bit, and while the ball does eventually bounce into a threatening position, Moist now has two players who are in the goal and ready to block the incoming shot. They make the save and keep the game tied before going on to eventually win the game in overtime. And since both of the plays that I just talked about featured him, it's only fair that I talk about how well Astro played on defense during the major. Recently, whenever I mentioned Astro on this channel, it's been pretty negative. Like when I would talk about his bad positioning on defense when he was on K-Corp, or when I was worried about the fit on Moist when he first joined this roster. But in Rotterdam, he played with a lot of composure, and was almost always making the right decision when he was in the third man position that would keep him and his team safe. When you combine that with the impact that he had on offense as well, I think that Astro is one of the most impressive players of the entire major. So after the way that I've talked down on him in my past few videos, it's only fair that I give him credit where it's due. Moist is still primarily an aggressive team, and when they're in form, they're very good at it. But this ability that they showed to adapt to their opponents when plan A wasn't working was really impressive. And if they're able to keep that up for the rest of the season, then this team will be one of the favorites to become the next world champion. I've recorded this whole voiceover while I have the flu, so I should probably stop talking now, but I'll try to make this outro quick. Usually after LANs, I do one long video where I include 5 different teams and I talk about all of them, but instead this time I'm going to break that up into separate videos. So if you have any requests, I'm all ears, especially if you make that request in my Discord, link in the description. And yeah, I'm going to go drink some more tea. Thanks for watching.